The drill bit snapped with a sickening metallic crack. The sharp sound echoed through the stifling, ozone-scented study, hanging in the heavy air like a death sentence. Finch cursed, ripping his protective goggles off his face and throwing them onto the imported Persian rug. He was sweating through his designer shirt, his chest heaving as he stared at the antique brass lockbox sitting on the mahogany desk. The box was no larger than a shoebox, heavy and dark, covered in intricate, century-old engravings that seemed to mock the high-tech tools scattered around it. Finch was the 25th expert to stand in this room over the last 48 hours. He was a high-tech security contractor flown in from out of state, a man who charged $10,000 just to open his titanium briefcase. He had brought diamond-tipped drills, thermal lances, and algorithmic decoders. He had brought fiber-optic cameras and sonic resonance emitters, and for the last 3 hours, he had failed completely. In the corner of the massive study, half hidden in the shadows of a towering oak bookshelf, Vada kept her head down. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the heavy wooden baseboards with a coarse yellow sponge. The smell of industrial ammonia rose from her plastic bucket, cutting through the rich, suffocating scents of dry cedar, expensive espresso, and imported leather that defined the room. She wore an oversized, faded blue uniform provided by a ruthless downtown staffing agency. The fabric was thinning at the elbows, held together at the collar by 2 dull safety pins. Her hands were raw, the skin around her knuckles cracked and bleeding slightly from years of exposure to cheap, corrosive bleach. She moved the sponge in slow, methodical circles, pressing hard against the wood to remove a scuff mark. She was invisible. That was the rule of her existence, the fundamental law of her survival in the gleaming glass canyons of Chicago. The hyper-wealthy men who owned these penthouses and mansions did not see the people who cleaned their floors. They saw algorithms, fiber optics, and digital ledgers. They lived in a frictionless world of abstract power, completely blind to the physical reality of dirt, weight, and manual labor. Vada relied on that blindness. It was her shield. As long as she stayed quiet, as long as she kept her eyes on the floorboards, she could survive the night shift, collect her meager wages, and make it back to the freezing, rust-belt decay of the South Side. But tonight, the silence in the room was different. It was not the relaxed, arrogant silence of wealthy men enjoying their power. It was the suffocating, terrifying silence of men who were out of time. Sitting behind the mahogany desk, perfectly still in a high-backed leather chair, was Ronan. He was the head of a modernized Chicago crime syndicate, a man who operated out of a 44th-floor glass office and controlled half the city's illicit logistics. He wore a dark, tailored suit that looked like it cost more than Vada would earn in a decade. His face was pale, exhausted, and carved from stone. He did not yell. He did not threaten Finch. He simply watched the broken drill bit roll across the desk, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet, absolute desperation. Standing just behind Ronan's shoulder was Bram. Bram was Ronan's underboss, a hulking mountain of a man whose massive frame threatened to burst the seams of his custom suit. He smelled constantly of sharp peppermint and heavy gun oil, a scent that drifted across the room and mixed with Vada's ammonia. Bram's hands were clasped in front of him, his knuckles white with tension. He glared at Finch with a cold, brutal intensity, waiting for a single nod from Ronan to end the contractor's life. Vada dipped her sponge into the cold, gray water of her bucket, wringing it out with a soft splash. She knew what was inside the brass box. She had heard them talking over the hum of her floor buffer an hour ago. Inside the box was a physical, leather-bound ledger. That ledger contained the offshore routing numbers and digital encryption keys needed to buy Ronan's younger brother back from a rival cartel faction. The ransom deadline was exactly midnight. It was currently 11:42. If that box did not open in 18 minutes, Ronan's brother was going to die in a freezing warehouse somewhere near the industrial shipyards. Finch wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand, reaching into his briefcase for another tool. He pulled out a sleek, black thermal lance, igniting the tip with a sharp hiss. A tiny, blinding blue flame erupted from the nozzle, superheating the air in the study. Finch leaned over the brass box, aiming the flame at the primary keyhole. He was trying to melt the internal tumblers, hoping to force the locking mechanism to collapse under extreme heat. Vada stopped scrubbing. She stayed on her knees, her aching spine screaming in protest, and watched the contractor work. She narrowed her eyes, observing the way the blue flame licked against the antique brass. She watched the smoke rising from the metal, a thick, dark gray plume that smelled faintly of burnt sugar and old tobacco. Finch was a fool. He was a man who understood lasers and microchips, but he did not understand the organic mechanics of the physical world. He did not understand dirt. Vada understood dirt better than anyone in Chicago. She spent 10 hours a night fighting it, analyzing it, breaking it down with chemicals and sheer physical force. She knew how things accumulated. She knew how time and neglect could turn dust into cement, how spilled liquids could harden into impenetrable resin. She looked at the heavy brass box, noting the dark, sticky residue caked deep inside the intricate engravings near the base. It was not a digital lock. It was a mechanical trap, built 50 years ago by someone who understood that the best way to protect a secret was to use the environment against the thief. Finch kept the thermal lance pressed against the keyhole, his face twisted in panic as the brass began to glow a dull, angry red. He was making it worse. The heat was not melting the tumblers. It was baking the hidden layers of grime inside the casing, fusing the internal gears together into a solid, immovable block of carbon. Vada felt a sharp pang of anxiety in her chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with Ronan's brother. She was doing the math in her head. Tomorrow was the 1st of the month. Her landlord, Gus, would be waiting on the crumbling concrete steps of her apartment building at dawn. Gus was a greasy, ruthless slumlord who smelled of stale beer and cheap cigars. He represented the daily, grinding exploitation of Vada's poverty. If she did not hand him exactly $300 in cash by 7 in the morning, he would change the locks on her door. He would throw her few possessions out into the freezing, wet snow of the South Side. She would be homeless in November, exposed to the biting wind chill off Lake Michigan that killed dozens of people every winter. She needed her shift wage tonight. She needed the $60 the staffing agency owed her for cleaning this mansion. But if Finch destroyed that box, if Ronan's brother died at midnight, there would be no payment. There would only be violence. The men in this room would tear each other apart, and the invisible cleaning woman in the corner would be caught in the crossfire. She could not afford to lose this money. Her survival depended on it. It was 11:46. 14 minutes left. Finch turned off the thermal lance, throwing it onto the desk in a panic. He grabbed a heavy steel pry bar, wedging the flat edge under the lid of the brass box. He grunted, putting his entire body weight into the lever, his boots slipping on the Persian rug. The brass groaned, a terrible, high-pitched screech of metal grinding against metal, but the lid did not move a single millimeter. Ronan slowly stood up from his leather chair. The movement was smooth, unhurried, and absolutely terrifying. He buttoned the front of his suit jacket, his eyes locked on Finch. The silence in the room deepened, becoming a physical weight that pressed against Vada's eardrums. Bram stepped forward, his massive hand reaching inside his jacket, resting on the grip of a concealed weapon. Finch backed away from the desk, his hands raised in the air, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He started to stammer, offering excuses about metallurgical density and thermal resistance, throwing out technical jargon to mask his failure. Ronan did not listen. He looked at the grandfather clock standing against the far wall. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth, ticking away the final seconds of his brother's life. Ronan closed his eyes, a flicker of profound, agonizing grief passing over his stoic features. He had all the money in the world. He controlled politicians, judges, and police captains. He could move millions of dollars across the globe with a single keystroke. But he could not open a piece of old metal sitting on his own desk. His wealth was entirely useless. Vada felt the cold water soaking through the knees of her uniform, chilling her skin to the bone. She looked at the bucket. She looked at the brass box. She looked at the clock. 11:48. If she spoke, she would break the rule. She would strip away her invisibility. She would force these dangerous, violent men to look at her, to acknowledge her existence. Once they saw her, she could never go back to being a ghost. She would become a variable in their world, a loose end, a potential threat. It was a massive risk. But the thought of Gus standing on those freezing concrete steps, the thought of the rattling radiator in her tiny apartment going cold forever, pushed her over the edge. She could not freeze to death on the street. Vada dropped the yellow sponge into the bucket. The splash sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Finch flinched. Bram whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto the dark corner where Vada knelt. Ronan opened his eyes, turning slowly to look at the woman he had completely ignored for the last 3 hours. Vada placed her cracked hands on her knees and pushed herself up. Her spine popped, a dull ache radiating down her lower back as she stood straight. She stepped out of the shadows, moving into the warm, yellow light of the crystal chandelier hanging above the desk. Bram moved instantly. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, placing his towering frame between Vada and Ronan. He looked down at her, his face twisted in a mask of brutal intimidation. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint and violence. He did not draw his weapon, but his sheer physical mass was meant to crush her spirit, to force her back into the corner where she belonged. Vada did not step back. She looked up at Bram, her face completely blank, her eyes flat and pragmatic. She had dealt with men like him her entire life, men who used their size to take up space, to push the poor and the weak into the gutters. She was not impressed by his tailored suit or his silent threats. She was just tired. She looked past Bram's massive shoulder, locking eyes with Ronan. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was gravelly and quiet, carrying the rough texture of exhaustion and the cold edge of a Chicago winter. She pointed a raw, chemical-stained finger at the brass box. She told Ronan that his expert was an idiot. She told him that the contractor was melting the trap, not the lock. The words hung in the air, heavy and blunt, completely devoid of the groveling respect these men were used to hearing. Finch let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, his face flushing with arrogant anger. He pointed at Vada, mocking her faded uniform, asking Ronan why he was letting a scrubwoman interrupt a highly sensitive security operation. Ronan did not look at Finch. He kept his dark eyes locked on Vada, studying her face, searching for any sign of panic or deception. He saw nothing but cold, hard realism. Ronan raised a single hand, a silent command that instantly silenced Finch's rambling. He told Bram to step aside. Bram hesitated for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenching, before he slowly moved to the left, opening a path to the desk. Vada walked forward. Her cheap rubber-soled shoes squeaked slightly on the polished hardwood floor. She stopped in front of the mahogany desk, standing inches away from the antique brass box. The heat radiating from the metal was intense, warming the cold dampness of her uniform. She looked down at the intricate engravings, tracing the dark, sticky residue with her eyes. Ronan asked her what she meant by a trap. His voice was smooth, deep, and perfectly controlled, but Vada could hear the microscopic tremor of desperation hiding beneath the surface. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the box, explaining the mechanics of dirt. She told him that the box was at least 50 years old. She pointed to the dark stains near the base, explaining that this box had likely sat on a desk in a room just like this one for decades. A room filled with men who smoked heavy cigars and drank expensive, sugary liquors. Over 50 years, the smoke and the spilled alcohol had settled over the brass. The sugar from the liquor and the tar from the tobacco had seeped into the microscopic crevices of the metal, mixing with the natural dust of the room. Time had baked that mixture into a thick, hardened resin, a substance as tough as industrial epoxy. She pointed to a small, nearly invisible seam running along the bottom edge of the box. She explained that the keyhole Finch was trying to drill was a decoy. The real locking mechanism was a pressure plate hidden beneath that seam, but the plate was jammed. It was glued shut by half a century of caramelized cigar resin. When Finch used the thermal lance, he wasn't melting brass. He was just superheating the sugar and tar, turning it into a liquid adhesive that immediately cooled and hardened again, sealing the plate even tighter. The high-tech tools were fighting the environment, and the environment was winning. Ronan stared at the box, his mind racing as he processed the brutal, physical logic of her words. He looked at the grandfather clock. 11:51. 9 minutes. He looked back at Vada, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He asked her if she could open it. Vada did not nod. She simply turned around and walked back to her plastic bucket in the corner of the room. Bram tensed, his hand hovering over his jacket, unsure if he should stop her. Vada reached into the front pocket of her faded uniform and pulled out a cheap, transparent plastic lighter. She then reached into her cleaning caddy and pulled out a generic, unmarked spray bottle filled with a clear liquid. She walked back to the desk, setting the spray bottle down next to the $1 million thermal lance. Finch scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, muttering that she was going to destroy the evidence. Vada ignored him. She picked up the spray bottle and adjusted the plastic nozzle to a fine mist. She told Ronan that the liquid was pure, undiluted white vinegar. It was the cheapest, most effective solvent in the world for breaking down organic resin. She held the bottle over the brass box, aiming the nozzle directly at the hidden seam along the bottom edge. She sprayed the vinegar heavily, soaking the dark, sticky grime. The sharp, acidic smell of the vinegar immediately filled the air, cutting through the heavy cedar and cologne. She waited exactly 30 seconds, counting the beats in her head, letting the acid eat into the hardened sugar and tar. She watched the dark residue begin to bubble slightly, turning from a solid crust into a thick, muddy sludge. Then, she picked up the cheap plastic lighter. She flicked the metal wheel with her thumb. A small, weak, yellow flame flickered to life. She held the flame directly against the soaked seam. The reaction was instantaneous. The vinegar boiled, turning into a highly acidic steam that forced its way deep into the microscopic gaps of the brass. The steam carried the heat directly into the core of the resin, breaking the chemical bonds of the caramelized sugar without melting the metal around it. A foul, acrid smoke rose from the box, smelling of rotting tobacco and burnt vinegar. Vada kept the flame steady, her hand perfectly still, her eyes locked on the seam. She could feel Bram breathing down her neck, the heavy, suffocating pressure of his presence. She could feel Ronan's absolute stillness, the terrifying weight of his expectation. She did not blink. She waited for the friction to die. At exactly 11:54, the bubbling stopped. The dark sludge thinned out, dripping slowly onto the mahogany desk. Vada extinguished the lighter and put it back in her pocket. She reached out with her raw, cracked hands, pressing her thumbs against the bottom edge of the brass box. She didn't use a pry bar. She didn't use force. She simply applied a firm, even pressure to the hidden plate. The room held its breath. For a second, nothing happened. Then, deep inside the heavy brass casing, a heavy mechanical clack echoed through the study. It was the sound of 50-year-old tumblers finally falling into place, released from their sticky prison. Vada slid her thumbs upward. The heavy brass lid swung open smoothly, resting on its hinges with a soft thud. Inside the box, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, was a small, black, leather-bound ledger. The silence in the room shattered. Ronan exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to drain the last reserves of his energy. He reached into the box, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the ledger out. He flipped it open, scanning the handwritten routing numbers and digital encryption keys on the first page. It was all there. His brother's life, written in blue ink. Ronan closed the ledger and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He looked at the grandfather clock. 11:55. He had 5 minutes to make the call and initiate the transfer. He turned to Bram, his voice sharp and commanding, ordering him to get the cartel brokers on the encrypted line immediately. Bram nodded, pulling a heavy satellite phone from his pocket and stepping out onto the freezing balcony to make the call. Finch stood frozen near the bookshelf, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. He looked at his diamond-tipped drills and his thermal lance, then looked at the cheap spray bottle of vinegar sitting on the desk. Ronan did not even acknowledge the contractor's existence. He turned his full attention back to Vada. Vada was already wiping the muddy sludge off the mahogany desk with a clean rag, her face completely devoid of emotion. She was finishing her job. Ronan watched her, fascinated by her brutal, unshakable pragmatism. He walked over to a heavy steel safe built into the wall behind his desk. He spun the dial, pulled the heavy door open, and reached inside. He pulled out a thick, heavy canvas duffel bag and dropped it onto the desk next to the open brass box. The bag hit the wood with a heavy, muffled thud. Ronan unzipped the top, revealing stacks of unbanded, used $100 bills. He looked at Vada, his voice smooth and respectful. He told her there was $50,000 in the bag. It was the bounty he had offered to any expert who could open the box before midnight. He pushed the bag across the desk, the canvas sliding over the polished wood, stopping inches from Vada's hands. He told her it was hers. He told her she had earned it, that she had just saved his family. Vada stopped wiping the desk. She looked at the canvas bag. She looked at the stacks of green paper, the chaotic, unbanded hundreds that smelled of old ink and dirty hands. $50,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. It was enough to pay Gus for 10 years. It was enough to fix the rattling radiator, to buy a new winter coat, to escape the crushing, freezing poverty of the South Side. It was a miracle, and it was a death sentence. Vada slowly shook her head, her eyes rising from the money to meet Ronan's gaze. She pushed the heavy canvas bag back across the desk, her cracked hands leaving a faint smudge of moisture on the fabric. Ronan frowned, a look of genuine confusion crossing his stoic face. He asked her why she was refusing the money. Vada let out a slow, exhausted breath. She looked around the opulent study, at the imported rugs and the crystal chandelier. She told Ronan that he did not understand how the real world worked. She told him that a woman who lived in a crumbling brick tenement, a woman who wore a thrift store uniform held together by safety pins, could not suddenly possess $50,000 in unbanded street cash. She explained the sheer logistical impossibility of her poverty. If she walked into her local Southside bank tomorrow morning and tried to deposit that cash, the teller would instantly flag her account. The bank manager would call the police. The police would drag her into an interrogation room, accuse her of dealing drugs or running numbers, and seize every single dollar under civil forfeiture laws. She would go to jail, and the state would keep the money. If she didn't put it in a bank, if she tried to hide it under her mattress, the neighborhood would know. In the slums, secrets did not exist. People noticed when you bought better groceries. People noticed when you paid your rent on time without arguing. The local gangs would smell the money on her. They would kick her door down in the middle of the night, put a gun to her head, and take the bag. And if she fought back, they would kill her and leave her body in a frozen dumpster in the alley. She looked Ronan dead in the eye, her voice hard and unforgiving. She told him that $50,000 in illegal cash was a luxury only rich men and criminals could afford to hold. For a poor girl, it was just a target painted on her back. Ronan stared at her, utterly stunned by the cold, flawless logic of her survival. He had spent his entire life using money as a weapon, throwing cash at problems to make them disappear. He had never considered that for someone at the absolute bottom of the socio-economic ladder, sudden wealth was a fatal disease. He looked at the canvas bag, suddenly seeing it not as a reward, but as a radioactive hazard. He slowly zipped the bag shut and pulled it off the desk. He asked her what she wanted. Vada did not hesitate. She told him she needed exactly $300, $250 for Gus, to keep the locks on her door, $50 for a cab ride back to the south side, because the L trains had stopped running at midnight and she was too exhausted to walk 3 miles in the freezing snow. Nothing more, nothing less. Ronan stood in silence for a long moment, studying the deep lines of exhaustion etched into her face. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a sleek silver money clip. He peeled off 3 crisp, perfectly flat $100 bills. He held them out to her. Vada reached out with her raw, cracked hand and took the money. She folded the bills carefully, slipping them deep into the front pocket of her uniform, securing them with a safety pin. She picked up her yellow sponge, dropped it into her plastic bucket, and grabbed the heavy metal handle. She did not say thank you. She did not say goodbye. She simply turned around and walked out of the stifling, ozone-scented study, leaving the wealthy men to their violent, complicated world. She walked down the long, silent hallways of the mansion, her rubber shoes squeaking faintly on the marble floors. She pushed through the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the brutal Chicago night. The transition was violent. The suffocating heat of the mansion instantly vanished, replaced by the biting, freezing wind chill whipping off Lake Michigan. The air smelled of sharp ice and wet asphalt. Vada shivered, pulling the thin collar of her uniform up around her neck as she walked down the long, sweeping driveway. The snow was beginning to fall again, heavy, wet flakes that melted instantly against the freezing pavement. She gripped the handle of her bucket tightly, feeling the reassuring weight of the $300 against her chest. She had survived. She had kept her apartment. She had played the game perfectly, stepping out of the shadows just long enough to secure her survival, and then retreating back into her invisibility. She reached the end of the driveway, stepping onto the dark, empty street to look for a passing cab. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt. Suddenly, the low, heavy purr of a massive engine cut through the howling wind. A sleek, matte black sedan pulled out from the shadows of a towering oak tree, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. The car rolled slowly toward her, the tires crunching softly against the icy road. It stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. The tinted rear window rolled down with a soft, electric hum. Bram sat in the back seat, his massive frame hidden in the darkness of the cabin. The sharp smell of peppermint and gun oil drifted out of the window, cutting through the freezing winter air. He did not say a word. He simply reached out of the window and flicked his wrist. A heavy matte black business card spun through the air, landing on the wet asphalt directly at Vada's feet. The window rolled up. The sedan accelerated smoothly, disappearing down the dark street, leaving nothing but red taillights fading into the snow. Vada stood frozen in the biting wind, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked down at the wet pavement. She slowly lowered her bucket, her aching knees popping as she crouched down to pick up the card. The cardstock was incredibly thick, heavy, and completely blank, except for a single line of silver-embossed text. It was an address in the loop. Below the address was a time: noon tomorrow. Vada stood back up, the freezing wind whipping her hair across her face. She stared at the silver letters, the cold reality of the situation crashing down on her like a physical weight. She had thought she was clever. She had thought she could just take her $300 and disappear back into the slums. But as she stood alone in the freezing Chicago night, holding the heavy black card, she realized her fatal mistake. She had shown Ronan that she could see the things his experts could not. She had shown him her mind. And in doing so, she had destroyed her only shield. The wind howled off the lake, tearing at the thin fabric of her coat as she shoved the heavy black card deep into her pocket. She did not look back at the dark street, nor did she look back at the towering iron gates of the mansion. She just kept walking, her head down, leaning into the freezing, biting wind chill that defined a Chicago November. She walked for 6 blocks until she found a lone cab idling outside a closed 24-hour diner, its exhaust pluming into the icy air like thick white smoke. The ride back to the south side was a silent, agonizing blur of orange streetlights and gray slush splashing against the windows. The cab driver did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. She just watched the city change outside the frosted glass. She watched the pristine, snow-swept streets of the Gold Coast slowly dissolve into the cracked asphalt, boarded-up storefronts, and rusted chain-link fences of her neighborhood. The cab dropped her off at the corner of her street, the driver refusing to go any further into the dark, unlit block. Vada paid him from her meager tips, carefully protecting the 3 crisp $100 bills pinned inside her pocket. She walked the last 2 blocks, her cheap rubber soles slipping on the freezing wet pavement. Her apartment building was a decaying 4-story brick structure that looked like it was slowly sinking into the frozen earth. The front door had no lock, the glass shattered years ago and replaced with a piece of warped plywood. She climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her aching spine screaming in protest with every step, the exhaustion settling deep into her marrow. When she finally unlocked her door, the apartment was freezing. The rattling radiator in the corner sounded like a dying man coughing, spitting out a meager hiss of steam that did nothing to fight the cold. The air smelled heavily of rust, old dust, and damp plaster. Vada did not take off her coat. She simply collapsed onto her narrow mattress, pulling a thin, scratchy wool blanket over her shoulders. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Every time she drifted off, she saw the heavy brass box, the blue flame of the thermal lance, and the terrifying, stoic face of Ronan. She managed exactly 2 hours of broken, shivering sleep before the gray light of dawn crept through her single, dirty window. It was time. Today was the 1st of the month. Vada forced herself up, her joints stiff and her cracked hands throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. She unpinned the $300 bills from her uniform pocket, smoothing out the crisp paper on her small laminate table. She walked down the 4 flights of stairs, the cold morning air biting at her face. Gus was already waiting on the crumbling concrete steps of the building. He was a heavy, greasy man who wore a stained leather jacket over a faded sweatshirt. He smelled overwhelmingly of stale beer, cheap cigars, and unwashed hair. He was leaning against the rusted iron railing, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes scanning the street with predatory boredom. Gus represented the daily, grinding exploitation of Vada's poverty. He did not fix the radiators, he did not repair the broken windows, and he did not care if his tenants froze to death in their sleep. He only cared about the 1st of the month. Vada walked up to him, her face a blank, emotionless mask. She held out the 3 crisp $100 bills. Gus took the cigarette out of his mouth, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the money. He was used to dirty, crumpled 10s and 20s, money scraped together from tip jars and pawn shops. He looked at the pristine, uncirculated hundreds, then looked up at Vada, a greasy smirk spreading across his face. He asked her who she had to rob to get paper that clean. Vada did not answer. She did not defend herself, and she did not explain. She simply stood there in the freezing wind, waiting for the transaction to be completed. Gus snatched the bills from her cracked hand, folding them roughly and shoving them into the pocket of his leather jacket. He offered 0 gratitude. He did not say thank you, and he did not tell her to have a good day. He just took a long drag from his cigarette, blew the smoke into the freezing air, and told her not to be late next month. Vada turned around and walked away, the crushing reality of her existence settling heavily on her shoulders. She had survived the night, she had paid her rent, but nothing had changed. She was still trapped in the exact same cycle, renting her survival 1 month at a time. But as she walked toward the L train station, she felt the heavy, matte black business card resting in her pocket. It was a physical anchor, a reminder that the cycle had been broken, whether she wanted it to be or not. The walk to the station was brutal, the wind whipping off the lake with a vicious, cutting intensity. She climbed the rusted steel stairs to the elevated platform, her breath pluming in the freezing air. The platform was crowded with the invisible workforce of Chicago. Men in heavy canvas jackets, women in thick wool scarves, all standing in silent, shivering misery, waiting for the train to take them to the kitchens, the loading docks, and the laundry rooms of the wealthy. The train arrived with an agonizing, screeching wail of metal grinding against metal. Vada stepped into the crowded car, grabbing a cold steel pole as the doors hissed shut. The car smelled of wet wool, old coffee, and the damp, sour scent of exhausted bodies. The ride downtown was a slow, rattling transition between 2 entirely different universes. As the train clattered along the elevated tracks, Vada watched the decaying brick tenements and rusted industrial yards of the south side slowly fade away. They were replaced by the gleaming, towering glass canyons of the Loop. The architecture shifted from crumbling concrete to polished steel, from broken windows to massive, mirrored facades that reflected the gray winter sky. The demographics inside the train car shifted as well. At every stop, the blue-collar workers shuffled off, heading toward the service entrances and the freight elevators. They were replaced by men and women in tailored wool coats, carrying expensive leather briefcases, smelling of dry cleaning and subtle perfumes. Vada remained on the train, her faded, oversized uniform standing out like a stain against the polished, wealthy commuters. She kept her eyes on the floor, maintaining her invisibility, but the black card in her pocket felt like a burning coal. She got off at the station in the heart of the Loop, stepping out into the freezing shadows cast by the massive skyscrapers. She walked 2 blocks, checking the silver-embossed address on the card against the numbers on the buildings. She stopped in front of a towering corporate mausoleum. It was a massive structure of black glass and brushed steel, completely devoid of warmth or character. There was no sign on the building, no corporate logo, just a set of heavy, revolving glass doors guarded by 2 men in dark suits. Vada pushed through the doors, stepping into a lobby that felt more like a cathedral than an office building. The floors were imported white marble, polished to a mirror finish. The walls were paneled in dark, rich mahogany. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and dry cedar. The silence in the lobby was absolute, a heavy, expensive quiet that was designed to intimidate. Vada walked toward the massive, curved reception desk. The woman sitting behind the desk wore a sharp, designer suit, her hair pulled back into a flawless, tight bun. She was typing on a sleek, silent keyboard, her eyes locked on a glowing monitor. As Vada approached, the receptionist did not look up. Her eyes slid right off Vada's faded uniform, her brain automatically categorizing the cleaning woman as part of the background, a piece of the furniture that did not require acknowledgement. Vada did not speak. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavy black card, and placed it flat on the pristine marble counter. The receptionist saw the card out of the corner of her eye. She stopped typing. She looked at the blank black card, then slowly raised her eyes to look at Vada. The look of absolute dismissal vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine, unsettled confusion. Without a word, the receptionist picked up a sleek black telephone, pressed a single button, and whispered into the receiver. She hung up, stood up from her chair, and gestured toward a bank of private elevators hidden behind a wall of frosted glass. She told Vada that the car was waiting for her. Vada walked past the desk, her cheap rubber shoes squeaking faintly on the marble, a sound that seemed deafening in the silent lobby. She stepped into the private elevator. There were no buttons on the panel, just a single glowing digital screen. The doors slid shut with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The elevator began to rise, moving with a terrifying, silent speed that made Vada's stomach drop. She felt the air pressure change, a sharp popping in her ears as she was launched high above the city streets. The digital screen ticked upward, flashing past the floors in a blur of red numbers. 30, 35, forte. The elevator slowed, coming to a smooth, imperceptible stop. The door slid open. Vada stepped out onto the 44th floor. The psychological intimidation of this space was entirely different from the mansion. The mansion had been built on old money, heavy wood, and antique brass. This floor was built on cold, sociopathic polish. It was a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass windows, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the freezing Chicago skyline and the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The floors were covered in a thick, charcoal gray carpet that completely swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Standing in the center of the massive reception area was Bram. In the harsh, natural light pouring through the glass, the hulking underboss looked even more massive, his tailored suit straining against the heavy muscle of his shoulders. The sharp scent of peppermint and gun oil radiated off him, cutting through the sterile, filtered air of the office. He looked at Vada, his cold, brutal eyes scanning her faded uniform, her cracked hands, and her exhausted face. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He simply turned around and walked down a long, glass-walled corridor, expecting her to follow. Vada followed him, keeping her eyes straight ahead, ignoring the dozens of men and women in sharp suits working silently behind the glass doors. They were the digital soldiers of Ronan's empire. They were the forensic accountants, the offshore routing specialists, the algorithmic traders who moved millions of dollars of illicit money through the global financial system without ever touching a physical dollar bill. Bram stopped in front of a massive, frosted glass door at the end of the corridor. He pushed it open, stepping aside to let Vada enter. Ronan's office was a corner suite, suspended high above the city like a glass cage in the clouds. The room was sparse, minimalist, and terrifyingly clean. There was no clutter, no paper, no personal photographs, just a massive desk carved from a single slab of black slate and a leather chair facing the windows. Ronan was standing by the glass, looking down at the crawling traffic of the loop far below. He wore a different suit today, a sharp charcoal gray cut that perfectly matched the cold, overcast sky outside. He looked just as exhausted as he had the night before, the dark circles under his eyes a testament to the crushing weight of his empire. He turned away from the window as Vada entered, his dark eyes locking onto her. He gestured to a sleek, modern chair across from his desk. He told her to sit. Vada walked across the thick carpet and sat down, keeping her back perfectly straight, her cracked hands resting on her knees. Ronan walked behind his desk and sat down, leaning back in his leather chair. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, the quiet authority of his presence filling the room. He did not waste time with small talk. He told her that the ledger she had secured last night had worked. The routing numbers had been verified, the digital encryption keys had unlocked the offshore accounts, and the transfer had been made. His brother was safe, recovering in a private clinic outside the city. Vada simply nodded, her face completely blank. She did not did not ask for details, and she did not offer congratulations. She knew that in this world, information was dangerous, and curiosity was fatal. Ronan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the cold slate of his desk. He told her that he had a new problem. He explained that his syndicate owned a massive portfolio of legitimate businesses across Chicago, used to wash the cash generated by their illicit operations. His crown jewel was a flagship restaurant located in the heart of the Gold Coast. It was a high-end, exclusive establishment that catered to the hyper-wealthy, serving imported Wagyu beef, white truffles, and $1,000 bottles of wine. It was supposed to be a flawless, highly profitable machine. But for the last 3 months, the restaurant had been bleeding money. A massive, catastrophic leak that was draining the profit margins dry. Ronan pointed to a sleek, silver laptop sitting on his desk. He told Vada that he had hired the best digital forensic accountants in the country, men who charged $1,000 an hour to analyze spreadsheets, track inventory algorithms, and audit the digital ledgers. They had spent weeks tearing the restaurant's digital footprint apart, and they had found absolutely nothing. According to the computers, the ledgers balanced perfectly. The digital inventory matched the sales receipts. The algorithms showed no anomalies, no skimming, no theft. But Ronan knew the money was gone. He knew the physical reality did not match the digital ghost. He looked at Vada, his eyes narrowing with intense, calculating focus. He told her that his experts were blind. They only understood the abstract world of numbers and fiber optics. They did not understand the physical mechanics of dirt, friction, and weight. They did not understand how things actually moved in the real world. He remembered how she had looked at the antique brass box. He remembered how she had ignored the high-tech tools and focused entirely on the physical accumulation of time and grime. He needed someone who could see the things his digital soldiers could not. He needed someone who understood the physical reality of a kitchen. Ronan reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of banded $100 bills. He tossed the stack onto the black slate desk. It hit the stone with a heavy, authoritative thud. He told her it was $10,000. It was an advance. He wanted her to take a job as a night shift cleaner at his flagship restaurant. He wanted her to use her mop as an auditing tool. He wanted her to find the leak. Vada stared at the stack of money. $10,000. It was a life-changing sum, but it was banded, traceable, and incredibly dangerous. Her internal monologue raced, calculating the brutal mathematics of survival. If she took the money, she was officially working for a crime syndicate. She would be stepping out of the shadows and into the line of fire. If she found the thief, Ronan would kill them. If the thief found out she was watching, the thief would kill her. It was a trap. But as she looked at Ronan's cold, unyielding eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. She was already in the trap. By opening that brass box, she had proven her worth. Men like Ronan did not let useful assets walk away. If she refused the job, she would become a liability. Someone who knew too much about his desperation and his family. She had no choice. She had to play the game, and she had to win. Vada reached across the cold slate desk and picked up the stack of money. She did not count it. She simply shoved it deep into the pocket of her faded uniform. She looked at Ronan, her voice gravelly and sharp. She told him she would start tonight. Ronan nodded, a faint, terrifying ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. He told her the address, and he told her to trust no one. The transition to the night shift was a descent into a completely different kind of chaos. The flagship restaurant was located on a pristine, snow-swept corner of the Gold Coast, its massive glass windows glowing with warm, golden light. Vada entered through the freezing, concrete service alley in the back, pushing through the heavy steel doors into the kitchen. The sensory overload was immediate and violent. The kitchen was a massive, sprawling industrial space of gleaming stainless steel and white ceramic tile. The air was thick, suffocating, and incredibly hot. It smelled of bruised basil, roasting garlic, caramelized sugar, and the heavy, rich scent of Wagyu beef fat searing on cast-iron pans. The noise was deafening. The massive fluorescent lights hummed loudly overhead, competing with the clatter of copper pans, the roaring flames of the gas stoves, and the constant, aggressive shouting of the line cooks. Vada was given a new uniform, a slightly cleaner, slightly better-fitting gray jumpsuit, and a heavy industrial mop bucket. She filled the bucket with scalding hot water and harsh chemical floor cleaner, the sharp smell of bleach cutting through the rich culinary scents. She stepped out onto the kitchen floor, lowering her head, instantly wrapping herself in her invisibility. The chefs and the sous chefs ignored her completely. They stepped over her mop. They yelled over her head. They treated her like a piece of mobile furniture. It was exactly what she needed. Vada began to scrub the floor mats, her eyes scanning the room, her mind working with cold, methodical precision. She did not look at the sleek iPads mounted on the walls. She did not look at the digital inventory screens glowing near the walk-in coolers. She knew the thief had already manipulated the digital world. She was looking for the physical evidence. She started with the trash. When she emptied the heavy, leaking garbage cans into the industrial dumpster out back, she did not just throw the bags away. She opened them. She ignored the rotting vegetables and the scraped plates. She counted the broken wine glass punts, the thick glass bases that survived when a delicate crystal stem shattered. She memorized the number, knowing she would check it against the physical breakage log later. She looked at the wear patterns on the floor tiles. She noticed that the heavy rubber mats near the dry storage room were worn down significantly more on the left side, indicating that heavy boxes were being dragged out, not carried. She watched the flow of goods. She watched how the prep cooks handled the massive, vacuum-sealed cuts of imported meat. She watched how the truffles were weighed on the digital scales. Everything seemed perfect. Everything seemed to match the digital ghost. But Vada knew that perfection was an illusion. Dirt always accumulated. Friction always left a mark. At 1 a.m, the restaurant finally closed its doors. The last of the wealthy patrons finished their expensive scotch and walked out into the freezing night. The kitchen began the brutal process of breaking down. The stoves were scrubbed, the cutting boards were bleached, and the floors were swept. By 1:30, the line cooks and the prep staff had clocked out, exhausted and smelling of stale grease. The kitchen fell into a heavy, echoing silence. The only sound was the low hum of the massive walk-in refrigerators and the dripping of a leaky faucet in the dish pit. Vada remained on the floor, pushing her heavy mop bucket down the long, stainless steel corridor near the back-loading dock. She was not alone. Standing near the walk-in freezer was Nolan. Nolan was the general manager of the restaurant. He was a polished, handsome man who wore a tailored, dark blue suit and a silk tie. But unlike the men on the 44th floor, Nolan was not calm. He was perpetually sweating, a thin sheen of moisture constantly coating his forehead. He moved with a nervous, twitchy energy, his eyes constantly darting toward the security cameras mounted on the ceiling. Vada knew about the cameras. She also knew that the cameras were digital, connected to the same network that the forensic accountants had audited. If Nolan was stealing, he knew how to blind the cameras, or he knew exactly where their blind spots were. Vada pushed her mop bucket closer, keeping her head down, her movements slow and rhythmic. She stopped near a massive stainless steel prep table, about 20 feet away from the freezer. She pulled a clean rag from her pocket and began to wipe down the metal legs of the table. She positioned herself perfectly, using the polished, mirror-like surface of a hanging copper pot to watch Nolan's reflection. It was 2 a.m. The kitchen was dead quiet. Nolan looked around, his eyes sweeping the empty corridor. He looked right at Vada, saw a gray uniform wiping a table leg, and immediately dismissed her. He turned his attention to the heavy, insulated door of the walk-in freezer. He did not punch his code into the digital keypad that tracked inventory access. Instead, he pulled a small, physical brass key from his pocket and unlocked the manual override cylinder at the bottom of the handle. He pulled the heavy door open, a thick cloud of freezing white vapor spilling out into the warm hallway. Nolan stepped inside. Vada stopped wiping the table. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She moved silently down the corridor, her rubber shoes making absolutely no sound on the wet tiles. She stopped just outside the freezer door, hiding in the blind spot of the overhead camera. She peered through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. Inside the freezing, brightly lit box, Nolan was moving with frantic, practiced speed. He was not looking at the digital scales. He was bypassing the inventory system entirely. He reached into the back of the highest shelf, pulling down 4 massive, vacuum-sealed cuts of A5 Wagyu beef. The meat was dark red, marbled with thick, pure white fat. Each cut was worth hundreds of dollars. He set the meat on a metal cart. Then, he reached into a locked wire cage in the corner. Using another physical key, he pulled out a small wooden crate filled with massive, dirt-covered white truffles. The earthy, pungent smell of the truffles cut right through the freezing air. Nolan loaded the crate onto the cart. He pushed the cart out of the freezer, his breath pluming in the cold air, and quickly locked the manual override. Vada retreated silently, slipping back to her mop bucket, dropping to her knees, and scrubbing the floor tiles with intense focus. She watched Nolan push the cart down the hallway, heading straight for the loading dock. But he didn't go to the back door. He stopped in front of the laundry staging area. Lined up against the wall were 4 massive, heavy canvas hampers on wheels. They were filled to the brim with the physical refuse of the kitchen's night shift. Dirty, grease-stained chef coats, sour-smelling aprons, and blood-soaked kitchen towels. The smell radiating from the hampers was foul, a mix of old sweat, rotting food, and harsh chemicals. Nolan looked around one last time. Then, he plunged his hands into the first canvas hamper, digging a deep hole into the pile of dirty laundry. He grabbed the vacuum-sealed Wagyu beef and shoved it deep into the center of the hamper, completely burying it beneath the sour aprons. He moved to the second hamper, burying the wooden crate of white truffles beneath a pile of blood-stained towels. He worked quickly, his tailored suit brushing against the filthy canvas, his face pale and sweating heavily. When he was finished, he smoothed out the top layers of laundry, making the hampers look completely undisturbed. He wiped his hands on a clean towel, threw it into the trash, and walked away, heading toward his front office to lock up for the night. Vada stayed on her knees, her hands resting in the scalding chemical water of her mop bucket. She watched Nolan disappear around the corner. She listened to the heavy click of his office door shutting. The silence rushed back into the hallway, heavy and suffocating. Vada slowly stood up, the water dripping from her cracked hands onto the floor tiles. She walked over to the laundry staging area. She stood alone in the chemical-smelling hallway, looking at the heavy canvas carts. The brilliance of the theft was staggering in its physical simplicity. The digital forensic accountants had been looking for altered spreadsheets, hacked algorithms, and offshore wire transfers. They had been looking for a digital ghost. But Nolan wasn't using a computer. He was using the trash. The laundry service arrived every morning at dawn. A massive, unmarked box truck that backed up to the loading dock. The drivers rolled the heavy canvas hampers onto the truck, taking them away to be washed. No one ever checked the dirty laundry. No security guard wanted to dig through sour aprons and blood-soaked towels. The stolen meat and truffles were simply rolled out the back door, hidden in plain sight, completely bypassing the digital scales, the inventory cameras, and the forensic audits. It was a purely physical smuggling route, built on the exact same blindness that Vada used to survive. The wealthy did not look at the dirt. Vada reached out, her raw fingers brushing against the rough canvas of the hamper. She felt the cold, heavy weight of the vacuum-sealed meat hidden deep inside. Her breath caught in her throat. She realized the absolute terrifying gravity of what she had just uncovered. She hadn't just found stolen meat. She hadn't just solved Ronan's accounting problem. She had just uncovered a secret that was going to end a man's life. In Ronan's world, there were no warnings, no firings, and no second chances. Theft was a betrayal, and betrayal was punished with brutal, physical violence. If she told Ronan what was inside these canvas carts, Nolan was going to die. The truck driver who picked up the laundry was going to die. The men who bought the stolen meat on the black market were going to die. Vada stood perfectly still, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing in her ears like a swarm of angry hornets. She looked down at her cracked, bleeding hands. She was no longer just a ghost scrubbing the floorboards. The air in the hallway suddenly felt impossibly thin. Vada could hear the slow, heavy thud of her own heartbeat echoing in the narrow space between the walk-in freezer and the laundry staging area. She stared at the heavy canvas hampers. They looked completely ordinary, just the invisible, dirty refuse of a high-end kitchen. But to Vada, they were a loaded gun. She closed her eyes, letting the harsh, chemical smell of the floor cleaner fill her lungs. She was trying to find a way out. She was trying to find a mathematical equation that would allow her to walk away from this without blood on her hands. If she turned around right now, if she picked up her mop bucket and went back to scrubbing the floor mats, she could pretend she had seen nothing. She could tell Ronan that his digital accountants were right, that the leak was just a phantom glitch in the algorithms. She could keep the $10,000 he had given her. It was enough money to pay Gus for years. Enough to fix the rattling radiator in her freezing South Side apartment. Enough to buy a heavy winter coat that wasn't held together by safety pins. But she knew the truth. She knew how men like Ronan operated. They did not accept failure, and they did not tolerate lies. If she lied to Ronan, he would eventually find out. The restaurant would continue to bleed money. The digital ledgers would continue to show a deficit, and Ronan would send someone else. He would send Bram. And when the hulking underboss found out that the invisible cleaning woman had taken $10,000 to look the other way, the violence would not fall on Nolan. It would fall on her. They would drag her out of her crumbling brick tenement in the middle of the night, take her to a freezing warehouse near the industrial shipyards, and she would disappear. Her life was already forfeit the moment she opened that antique brass box in the mansion. She had stepped out of the shadows, and the shadows had closed in behind her. There was no going back. Vada opened her eyes. The flat, pragmatic realism that had kept her alive for 30 years settled over her like a heavy iron blanket. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the first canvas hamper. The fabric was rough, damp, and smelled of sour sweat. She plunged her raw, cracked hands deep into the pile of dirty laundry, pushing past the grease-stained chef coats and the wet aprons. Her fingers brushed against the cold, smooth plastic of the vacuum-sealed Wagyu beef. She gripped the heavy cut of meat and pulled it out. It was massive, weighing at least 10 pounds, the dark red muscle and thick, pure white fat looking almost obscene under the harsh fluorescent lights. She set the meat on the stainless steel prep table. She reached back into the hamper and pulled out the other 3 cuts. Then she moved to the second hamper, digging through the blood-soaked kitchen towels until her fingers scraped against the rough wood of the small crate. She pulled it out, the earthy, pungent smell of the white truffles immediately overpowering the scent of the bleach. She set the crate next to the meat. She looked at the stolen goods, tens of thousands of dollars worth of inventory sitting on a metal table in the middle of the night. She needed to present it to Ronan. She needed to show him the physical reality of the theft. Vada walked over to the dish pit. Tucked under the massive stainless steel smash was a roll of heavy, industrial-grade trash bags. They were thick, black plastic, designed to hold broken glass and rotting food without tearing. She tore one off the roll, the plastic snapping loudly in the quiet kitchen, and snapped it open so it billowed out like a dark parachute. She walked back to the prep table. She picked up the first cut of Wagyu beef and dropped it into the bag. It hit the bottom with a heavy, wet thud. She dropped the second cut, then the third, then the fourth. Finally, she picked up the wooden crate of truffles and dropped it in on top of the meat. The bag was incredibly heavy, weighing over 50 pounds. Vada grabbed the thick plastic at the top and twisted it shut. She tried to lift it, but her aching spine screamed in protest. The muscles in her lower back, already exhausted from hours of scrubbing baseboards, locked up with a sharp, burning pain. She let out a low, ragged breath, her breath pluming slightly in the cold air near the freezer. She could not carry it. She would have to drag it. She gripped the twisted plastic with both hands and leaned back, using her body weight to pull the bag off the floor. The heavy plastic scraped against the ceramic tiles with a loud, abrasive hiss. She began to walk backward, dragging the bag down the long, stainless steel corridor. The kitchen was a labyrinth of metal and tile, a purely functional space designed for speed and efficiency. But at 3:30 in the morning, it felt like a tomb. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerators, the dripping faucet in the dish pit, and the relentless, scraping hiss of the heavy black bag sliding across the floor. As she dragged the bag past the main cooking line, she noticed a small tear in the bottom of the plastic. The sharp corner of the wooden truffle crate had punctured the heavy material. A slow, steady drip of condensation and faint, watery blood began to leak from the bag, leaving a dark, smeared trail across the pristine white tiles. Vada did not stop. She did not care about the mess. She was no longer the cleaning woman. She was the auditor, and she was bringing the ledger to the boss. She reached the heavy, leather-padded swinging doors that separated the back of the house from the front of the house. This was the boundary line. This was the border between the physical world of dirt and labor and the insulated world of wealth and illusion. Vada turned around, pressing her back against the leather doors. She pushed backward, her cheap rubber shoes slipping slightly on the wet tiles, and the doors swung open with a soft, pneumatic sigh. Vada stepped backward into the dining room, dragging the heavy bag with her. The transition was jarring. The harsh, blinding fluorescent lights of the kitchen were gone. replaced by the soft, amber glow of hidden wall sconces. The air no longer smelled of bleach and roasting garlic. It smelled of expensive floor wax, dry cedar, and the faint, lingering scent of $1,000 wine. The temperature was perfectly regulated, a comfortable, insulated warmth that felt entirely alien to a woman who spent her life shivering. The dining room was massive, a sprawling expanse of imported, dark mahogany hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out onto the freezing streets of the Gold Coast. The tables were spaced far apart, offering absolute privacy to the hyper-wealthy patrons. Each table was draped in pristine, heavy Egyptian cotton tablecloths, glowing softly in the dim light. The chairs were upholstered in deep, crushed velvet. It was a room designed to make the outside world disappear. It was 4:15 in the morning, and the city outside the glass was dead. The only movement on the street was a massive, yellow city street sweeper moving slowly down the snow-swept avenue. The heavy, rotating brushes of the machine scraped against the frozen asphalt, sending deep, rhythmic vibrations through the thick glass of the restaurant windows. The vibrations rattled the crystal wine glasses sitting on the empty tables, a low, harmonic hum that filled the silent room. Vada turned around, her hands still gripping the twisted plastic of the trash bag. She looked across the vast, empty dining room. In the far corner, sitting in a deep, circular booth wrapped in dark leather, was Ronan. He was completely still, a shadow among shadows. The only illumination near him was a small, brass table lamp casting a pool of warm light onto the pristine white tablecloth. He was wearing his charcoal gray suit, his tie loosened slightly at the collar, looking like a man who had not slept in a decade. Standing 10 feet away from the booth, perfectly blended into the darkness near the coat check, was Bram. The massive underboss was motionless, his hands clasped in front of him. Even from across the room, Vada could feel the heavy, suffocating pressure of his presence. He was the muscle, the enforcer, the physical manifestation of Ronan's quiet authority. He watched Vada with cold, dead eyes as she stood in the doorway. Vada tightened her grip on the bag. She leaned forward and began to walk toward the booth. The sound of the heavy plastic dragging across the imported mahogany floor was deafening in the silent room. It was a harsh, ugly, violent sound. It was the sound of the South Side invading the Gold Coast. With every step, the tear in the bottom of the bag grew slightly larger. A thick, dark mixture of condensation, dirt from the wooden crate, and raw, watery blood leaked onto the polished wood, leaving a permanent, physical stain on the flawless environment. Ronan did not move. He simply watched her approach. He watched the exhausted, invisible cleaning woman dragging a leaking garbage bag across his $1,000,000 floor. He watched the dark trail of water and blood ruining the mahogany. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly fascinated, watching the physical reality of his business finally reveal itself. Vada reached the edge of the circular booth. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving beneath her faded gray uniform. Her cracked hands were trembling from the sheer physical exertion of the drag. She looked down at Ronan, and he looked back up at her, his dark, world-weary eyes reflecting the amber light of the brass lamp. He had a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch resting on the table in front of him. The smell of the peat and the alcohol mixed with the sharp metallic scent of the blood leaking from the bag. Vada did not say a word. She simply bent her knees, gripped the bottom of the heavy plastic bag, and heaved it upward with the last ounce of her strength. She swung the bag over the edge of the table and slammed it down directly onto the pristine, glowing white Egyptian cotton tablecloth. The impact was violent. The heavy cuts of meat in the wooden crate crashed against the wood beneath the fabric. The crystal scotch glass rattled violently, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim. The tear in the bottom of the bag ripped wide open. The dark, watery blood and the black dirt from the truffle crate spilled out, instantly soaking into the pure white cotton. The stain spread rapidly, a horrific, visceral bloom of red and black ruining the flawless fabric. The smell of raw, cold meat, sour laundry, and wet dirt exploded into the sterile, cedar-scented air of the dining room. It was a complete, undeniable desecration of Ronan's insulated world. Vada stood over the table, her hands resting on the torn plastic. She looked Ronan dead in the eye. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was gravelly, sharp, and completely devoid of fear. She told him that his digital forensic accountants were fools. She told him that they had spent weeks looking at glowing screens, searching for missing numbers in a cloud of data. But they had forgotten that a restaurant was a physical place. They had forgotten that meat had weight, that truffles had mass, and that things had to be moved with human hands. She pointed a raw, chemical-stained finger at the bloody bag. She told Ronan that Nolan was not hacking the inventory algorithms, he was simply bypassing them. She explained the physical mechanics of the theft with cold, methodical precision. She told him about the manual override key on the walk-in freezer and how Nolan waited until the kitchen was dead, until the digital cameras were either blinded or ignored. She explained how he loaded the most expensive, untraceable items onto a metal cart. Then, she explained the brilliance of the laundry. She told Ronan about the heavy canvas hampers sitting in the staging area, describing the smell of the sour aprons and the blood-soaked towels. She told him how Nolan buried the vacuum-sealed Wagyu and the wooden crates of truffles deep inside the dirty linen. She explained that the laundry service arrived at dawn, a massive box truck that rolled the hampers right out the back door. No security guard checked the dirty laundry, and no digital scale weighed the trash. The stolen goods were smuggled out in plain sight, hidden beneath the physical disgust of the wealthy. Vada finished her explanation and stood straight, her aching spine popping softly in the quiet room. She looked at the bloody, dirt-stained tablecloth. She told Ronan that the leak was not in his computers. The leak was in his trash, and she had just dragged it into his dining room. Ronan sat in absolute silence. The street sweepers outside continued to vibrate the glass, a low, mechanical heartbeat that underscored the heavy tension in the room. He looked at the torn plastic bag, the dark red blood soaking into the white cotton, and the dirt. Then, he slowly raised his eyes and looked at Vada. The exhaustion in his face seemed to vanish, replaced by a sharp, terrifying clarity. He realized the profound, undeniable brilliance of her working-class perspective. She had seen the truth because she was the only one who actually looked at the dirt. Ronan slowly reached out and picked up his crystal glass. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch, letting the expensive liquor burn down his throat, before setting the glass back down on the dry edge of the table. He did not raise his voice, and he did not show a single trace of anger. He simply turned his head slightly, looking into the dark shadows near the coat check, and spoke to Bram. His voice was smooth, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. He told Bram to find Nolan, to find the truck driver who ran the laundry route, and to make sure they never saw the sun come up. The order was given with the same casual indifference a man might use to order a second cup of coffee. There was no trial, no interrogation, only the absolute, brutal finality of the corporate mafia. Bram stepped out of the shadows, but he did not nod or speak. He simply turned around, his heavy leather shoes silent on the mahogany floor, and walked out the front doors of the restaurant, disappearing into the freezing Chicago night to execute two men. Vada stood frozen at the table. The reality of what had just happened hit her with the force of a physical blow. She experienced a severe, violent psychological crash. The adrenaline that had carried her through the kitchen, that had given her the strength to drag the heavy bag, suddenly evaporated. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Her cracked hands began to shake uncontrollably. She stared at the blood spreading across the white tablecloth. It was no longer just the blood of a slaughtered cow. It was the blood of Nolan, and the blood of a truck driver she had never even met. She had uncovered the secret, she had presented the evidence, and she had pulled the trigger. She had thought she was just doing an audit, just surviving, but she had just become an active participant in a murder. The crushing weight of her complicity settled over her chest, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe. Ronan watched her shake. He saw the horror in her eyes, the sudden, violent realization of the world she had just stepped into. He did not pity her, and he did not offer comfort. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal gray suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy brick of cash. It was not the unbanded, chaotic street money from the mansion. It was 5 thick stacks of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills, bound tightly in purple bank bands. $50,000, clean, untraceable, and perfectly packaged. Ronan tossed the brick of cash onto the table. It landed directly in the center of the spreading bloodstain. The crisp white paper of the bills immediately began to soak up the dark red liquid, the edges turning a violent, rusty crimson. It was a horrific, beautiful image of exactly what the money represented. It was wealth built on violence, survival bought with blood. Ronan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the table, ignoring the dirt and the water. He looked up at Vada, his voice dropping to a low, resonant murmur that carried the gravelly texture of absolute power. He told her to stop shaking. He told her that she was experiencing the shock of consequence, but that she had nothing to be ashamed of. He told her that she had just learned the fundamental truth of the city. He gestured to the empty, luxurious dining room. He told her that the people who ate at these tables, the hyper-wealthy men and women who lived in the glass penthouses, believed they were innocent. They believed their hands were clean because they never touched the dirt. They paid accountants to hide their money, They paid lawyers to crush their enemies, and they paid men like Ronan to handle the violence. They lived in a frictionless world of digital illusion, completely blind to the physical suffering that kept their world spinning. Ronan looked back at Vada, his eyes locking onto hers with an intense, piercing focus. He told her that she was different, that she knew what it cost to survive. She knew the physical pain of scrubbing the floorboards, the biting cold of the wind chill, and the terrifying math of paying a slumlord just to keep a roof over her head. He told her that poverty was not a virtue. Poverty was just a slower, quieter kind of violence. It was a slow death by freezing, by starvation, by exhaustion. He pointed to the blood-stained money on the table. He told her that she had always lived in his world. A world defined by brutal, unforgiving mechanics. The only difference was that for 30 years, she had been the one being crushed by the gears. She had been the invisible ghost, scrubbing the baseboards while the wealthy ate. He told her that tonight, she had finally stopped scrubbing. Tonight, she had proven that she could see the gears, that she could manipulate the mechanics. He told her that he was not corrupting her. He was just finally inviting her to sit down in the dining room. Vada stared at the $50,000. The purple bank bands were soaked in blood, but the money was heavy, real, and entirely hers. She thought about Gus, waiting on the crumbling concrete steps. She thought about the rattling radiator, the smell of rust, the screeching L trains, and the biting wind off Lake Michigan. She thought about the 30 years she had spent making herself invisible, hoping that if she just stayed quiet enough, the world would not crush her. Ronan was right. Her old life was just a slower kind of death. She had been dying by inches every single day, trading her physical body for a few crumpled dollars just to survive the night. The moral outrage, the guilt over Nolan's impending death, began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard, terrifying pragmatism. Nolan had made his choice. He had stolen from a cartel, and he had lost. Vada had made her choice, too. She had chosen to survive, and in Chicago, survival was never clean. Vada stopped shaking. The flat, emotionless mask slid back over her face, locking her psychological crash away in a dark corner of her mind. She reached out with her raw, cracked hands and did not hesitate. She picked up the heavy brick of cash from the table. The blood smeared across her palms, mixing with the chemical burns from the bleach, but she did not wipe it off. She simply shoved the $50,000 deep into the pocket of her gray uniform. Ronan watched her take the money, a look of profound, quiet respect settling over his exhausted features. He reached into his pocket one last time and pulled out a small, sleek, matte black burner phone. He set it on the dry edge of the table, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped inches from Vada's hand. He did not tell her what it was for, and he did not tell her when he would call. He didn't have to. The contract was sealed. She was no longer a cleaner. She was his auditor, his eyes in the physical world. Vada picked up the black phone and slipped it into her pocket, right next to the blood-stained money. She looked at Ronan one last time, acknowledging the terrifying partnership they had just forged in the silent, empty restaurant. Then, she turned around. She did not look back at the torn garbage bag, the ruined Egyptian cotton, or the dark trail of water on the mahogany floor. She walked away from the booth, her rubber shoes squeaking faintly in the quiet room. She pushed through the heavy leather swinging doors, stepping back into the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. She walked past the stainless steel prep tables, past the walk-in freezer, and past the laundry staging area. She saw her heavy industrial mop bucket sitting in the middle of the corridor, the scalding chemical water slowly turning cold. She did not pick it up. She left the mop leaning against the wall and walked to the heavy steel service doors at the back of the kitchen. She pushed the metal crash bar. The doors swung open, and Vada stepped out into the freezing Chicago dawn. The sky above the city was a bruised, pale gray, the heavy snow finally stopping. The biting wind chill whipped through the concrete alley, tearing at her uniform. But for the first time in her life, she did not shiver. She felt the heavy, solid weight of the money and the phone in her pocket. She walked down the alley, her boots crunching softly on the fresh ice, leaving her mop, her bucket, and her life as a ghost behind forever.